The fourth floor of the campus library at 2 in the morning is a fluorescent-lit purgatory. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and pure spite, desperately trying to finish grading midterms, when the shadows in the aisle shifted. He was massive, a wall of denim and flannel that completely blocked the emergency exit sign. I couldn't see his face in the dim lighting, just the sheer, ridiculous width of his shoulders as he took a heavy step forward. "Maya," he rumbled. The sound vibrated right through the metal bookshelves, a low, chest-deep resonance clearly designed to make me tremble, submit, or whatever macho nonsense he usually pulled to get his way. He took another step, trapping me against the reference desk. "I'm not doing the reading. You're going to." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. Survival instinct and severe caffeine poisoning took the wheel. I grabbed the closest, heaviest object on the desk, a 1,200-page hardcover edition of Principles of Modern Macroeconomics, and swung it with the terrifying strength of a woman who hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. The impact was a wet, heavy thud. The mountain of a man crumpled instantly, hitting the industrial carpet with a floor-shaking crash. I stood frozen, clutching the textbook to my chest, gasping for air. I had just killed a student. I was going to prison. I couldn't afford prison on my pathetic salary. Then, the giant slowly sat up. He pinched the bridge of his profusely bleeding nose, looked up at me, and sighed. "Are you done? Because I really need to pass this class."
Chapter 1. I stood perfectly still, my knuckles white around the spine of the textbook. The man bleeding on the geometric carpet didn't look like a college student. He looked like he chopped down redwoods for cardio. "Take this," I muttered, shoving a wad of single-ply library napkins toward his face. He accepted them with a massive, calloused hand, pressing the rough paper against his nose. The sharp, clean scent of pine needles and iron drifted up, cutting through the stale, dusty smell of the archives. He hauled himself to his feet, a process that seemed to take an unnervingly long time given his sheer mass, and pulled out a tiny plastic chair at the nearest study desk. The cheap furniture creaked in genuine agony as he sank into it. "Let's try this again," he said, dropping his voice into a gravelly rumble that vibrated straight through the floorboards and into the soles of my cheap sneakers. He leaned forward, bracing his thick forearms on the table, deliberately invading my personal airspace. The physical tactic was obvious. He was trying to fill the room, to remind me of the sheer size difference between us. "I'm Conrí, and I'm not writing a 10-page essay on fiscal policy. You're just going to sign the tutoring compliance form, and we'll call it a day." Click. I unspooled the cap from my red ballpoint pen. It sounded aggressively loud in the dead quiet of the fourth floor. "Sit up straight," I said flatly. Conrí blinked, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking his heavy scowl. "Excuse me?" "You're slouching," I told him, tapping the red pen rhythmically against my clipboard. "It's terrible for your lumbar spine, and frankly, it's a profoundly unoriginal attempt at physical posturing. Posture is 10% of your participation grade." I deliberately touched the pen to his blank intake sheet, dragging the ink to form a sharp, unforgiving -5 at the top of the page. His dark eyes widened imperceptibly, tracking the red ink. "You just docked me points. We haven't even opened a book." "And yet, you are already failing," I replied smoothly, sliding into the chair across from him. My head was pounding from an espresso hangover. My rent was exactly 4 days past due, and I had exactly 0 patience for overgrown men trying to bully their way out of homework. I didn't care how broad his chest was. I held the gradebook. I flipped open my ruined copy of Macroeconomics, the pages slightly crumpled from where it had forcefully met his cheekbone. "If you want the signature that keeps the administration off your back, you do the work. The university pays me to tutor, Conrí, not to forge academic documents for people who are afraid of spreadsheets." "I'm not afraid of spreadsheets," he countered instantly, though the tight clench of his jaw suggested otherwise. He crossed his arms, the muscles straining against his flannel sleeves. I just don't have time for this corporate busywork. I have an entire community to run. We all have problems. Mine is surviving on instant noodles. Yours is understanding market equilibrium. I pushed the massive textbook across the table. It slid to a halt, hitting his crossed arms with a dull thud. Read chapters 1 through 3 by Thursday. Take detailed notes. If you try to hand me bullet points written on the back of a receipt again, I'm docking another 10 points. Conrí stared down at the textbook like it was a live explosive. The heavy, oppressive confidence he had marched in with completely evaporated, replaced by a rigid, white-knuckled tension. Looking at his broad shoulders slumped in absolute dread, I realized something incredibly dangerous. This terrifying mountain of a man had absolutely no idea what he was doing, and I was the only thing standing between him and total academic ruin. Chapter 2. The 24-hour waffle diner on the edge of town smelled permanently of burnt sugar, industrial floor cleaner, and the profound regrets of its patrons. At 2 a.m, it was exactly where we needed to be. Look at the graph, I instructed, tapping my red pen against the laminated surface of the table. Just look at the graph, Conrí. Across the cramped, sticky booth, Conrí was staring at the textbook like it had personally insulted his ancestors. His sheer physical mass was entirely incompatible with the cheap vinyl seating. His broad shoulders eclipsed the window behind him, and beneath the table, his long legs were tangled awkwardly, his knees occasionally brushing mine. Every time they did, a jolt of entirely unhelpful electricity shot up my calves. I ignored it. I was a professional. A highly caffeinated, deeply underpaid professional. I am looking at it, Conrí rumbled, his deep voice carrying a note of primal frustration. And it makes absolutely no sense. You're telling me that this company intentionally hoarded a surplus of winter coats, refused to distribute them to the people who were freezing, and instead shipped them to a warehouse to create artificial scarcity? Yes, I rasped, taking a sip of coffee that tasted remarkably like battery acid. To drive up the market price, its basic supply and demand. Conry's jaw clenched so hard I thought I heard a molar crack. That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. If part of the pack, the community, is cold, you distribute the coats. If you hoard resources while your people freeze, you get challenged and your throat ripped out. It's bad leadership. It's excellent capitalism, I corrected, rubbing my burning eyes. Corporate CEOs don't operate on pack loyalty, Conry. They operate on profit margins. No one is ripping out the CEO's throat. They should, he stated matter-of-factly. It would correct the market instantly. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob of exhaustion. You can't write that on the midterm. The Board of Regents frowns heavily on throat ripping as an economic policy. Bureaucrats, Conry muttered, finally dragging his gaze away from the textbook to look at me. His dark eyes softened slightly, tracking the dark circles under my eyes. You're shaking. I'm vibrating, I corrected, gesturing with my pen. It's a side effect of drinking 4 espressos on an empty stomach. Focus on the elasticity of demand. If the price goes up, demand goes down, he finished automatically, though his attention was no longer on the page. He was looking at my plate of untouched, rapidly cooling hash browns. Eat your food, Maya. I don't have time to eat. I have to fix your fundamental misunderstanding of the modern financial system before Thursday. I leaned forward, my elbows slipping slightly on the sticky table. If the price of a substitute good decreases, what happens to the demand for the original good? It drops, he said, his voice lowering, taking on that smooth, rumbling cadence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Eat the hash browns. Stop trying to alpha me into eating potatoes, I snapped, pointing the pen at his nose. I am immune to your scary voice. What happens to the supply curve? It shifts left, Conry answered, leaning forward so our faces were only inches apart. The scent of him, crushed pine needles, rain, and clean soap, completely overwhelmed the smell of stale grease. And I wasn't trying to scare you. I was trying to feed you. I'm fine, I mumbled, though the words felt thick on my tongue. The adrenaline of our earlier library encounter was crashing hard. The fluorescent lights overhead began to hum a lullaby. Just read the section on monopolies. Out loud. I'm just going to rest my eyes for exactly 30 seconds. I crossed my arms on the sticky table and lowered my heavy head onto them. Maya, 30 seconds, I whispered into my sleeves. Read. He sighed, a deep, resonant sound, and I heard the rustle of pages. His low, gravelly voice began to read about antitrust laws. It was the most soothing sound I had ever heard. The diner faded away. I didn't know how much time had passed when awareness slowly trickled back. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The burnt sugar was gone, replaced entirely by the intense, comforting scent of cedar and pine. I was incredibly warm. I blinked my eyes open. I was still slumped over the table, but a heavy, fleece-lined flannel jacket had been draped carefully over my shoulders, tucking me in. The second thing I noticed was the silence. The diner's awful overhead pop music had been completely shut off. The clattering of plates had ceased. I slowly sat up, rubbing my cheek. The diner was packed with a rowdy crowd of post-party frat boys, but not a single one of them was speaking above a hushed, terrified whisper. Conrí wasn't in the booth. I turned my head. He was standing by the entrance, arms crossed over his chest, his massive frame blocking the aisle leading to my booth. He was staring down a group of very drunk, very loud college students who had just walked in. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his chin, his dark eyes locking onto the loudest boy in the group. The absolute, predatory stillness rolling off Conrí was suffocating. The frat boy swallowed hard, took one look at Conry's unblinking stare, and slowly backed out the door. Conrí turned, caught me looking, and his terrifying expression instantly melted into sheepish panic. Chapter 3. The midday sun on the campus quad was blinding, but at least the fresh autumn air helped clear the residual fog of my diner nap. I marched briskly down the paved walkway, my oversized tote bag aggressively packed with flashcards. Conrí walked beside me. Or rather, he strolled effortlessly while I speed-walked to keep up with his massive strides. He had returned his flannel jacket to his own shoulders, but the phantom warmth of it was still making my skin prickle. I refused to acknowledge it. You didn't have to terrorize the Sigmachas, I said, not looking at him, or bribe the diner manager to turn off the jukebox. I didn't bribe him, Conrí replied casually, his hands shoved into the pockets of his dark jeans. I just asked politely. Conrí, you are 6'5" and built like a commercial freight train. When you ask someone politely to do something while staring at them without blinking, it is considered a threat. You don't seem threatened, he pointed out. I have tenure-track professors to deal with. I fear nothing. I pulled a crumpled granola bar from my pocket and tore the wrapper open with my teeth. We have an hour before your practice quiz at the testing center. We need to review your weak spots. Conrí let out a long, suffering sigh. Can we talk about something else for 5 minutes? You work too hard, Maya. It's admirable. You have incredible stamina. I stopped chewing. I looked up at him. He was staring straight ahead, the tips of his ears turning a very faint shade of red. Was he trying to flirt with me? The terrifying alpha of the local shifter pack was trying to deliver a smooth compliment, and it sounded like a performance review. Thank you? I offered hesitantly. My stamina is fueled entirely by financial anxiety. Right. Well. Conrí cleared his throat, trying to lean casually against a nearby oak tree. The tree groaned under his weight. I just meant, I notice how much effort you put in. You're very aggressive. I like that in a... He froze. I paused halfway through a bite of my granola bar. In a what? Conrí wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were locked onto the ground near my left shoe. A very fat, very bold campus squirrel had waddled out of the bushes and was sniffing the corner of my tote bag, eyeing the crumbs falling from my granola bar. The shift in Conrí was instantaneous. The awkward, nervous student vanished. His shoulders locked, his jaw tightened, and a low, terrifyingly deep sound began to vibrate in his chest. It wasn't a human noise. It was a guttural, primal snarl of absolute territorial possession. Mine. Back off. The squirrel froze. Its tiny black eyes widened in sheer evolutionary terror. It dropped the acorn it was holding and bolted across the grass at the speed of light, scrambling up a brick building to escape the apex predator. Silence fell over our section of the quad. A few passing freshmen gave Conrí a wide, frightened berth. Conrí blinked, shaking his head slightly, the rumble dying in his throat. He looked at me, a mortified expression washing over his sharp features. I don't know why I did that. I apologize. That was highly unprofessional. I stared at him for a long, quiet moment. I reached into the depths of my tote bag, pushing aside my grading rubrics and a spare stapler, and pulled out a blue foam stress ball shaped like the globe. I held it out to him. He looked at it. "What is this?" "It's a stress ball," I said, completely deadpan. "Squeeze it when you feel the overwhelming biological urge to terrorize the local wildlife over a granola bar." He took it gently, his massive fingers dwarfing the tiny foam earth. "Maya." "Don't worry about it," I sighed, adjusting my bag. "Resource guarding. It's basic behavioral economics, but if you growl at the proctor during this quiz, I can't save you." Conrí squeezed the foam ball, his knuckles turning white. His playful demeanor vanished entirely, replaced by that heavy, crushing dread I had seen in the library. He leaned his back against the oak tree, looking suddenly exhausted. "If I fail this practice test, I'm not ready for the midterm," he said quietly, his voice cracking just a fraction. "And if I bomb the midterm, the university places me on academic probation. The developers have lawyers waiting, Maya. They'll use the probation to invalidate my land deed." The raw vulnerability in his voice made my chest physically ache. I stepped closer, entirely abandoning my professional distance. "You aren't going to fail," I promised fiercely. "I won't let you." The university testing center was designed to drain the human spirit. It was a windowless, heavily air-conditioned bunker filled with perfectly aligned rows of tiny plastic desks. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic scratching of graphite on paper and the ticking of a large analog clock on the wall. I wasn't allowed inside. I was forced to sit in the hallway, watching through a narrow pane of reinforced glass in the door. Conrí looked absurd in there. The desk was built for an 18-year-old accounting major, not a fully grown werewolf. His knees were practically bracketing his ears, his massive shoulders hunched over the Scantron sheet as if he were trying to physically shield it from an attacker. Things were going poorly. Through the glass, I watched Conrí grip his standard issue number 2 pencil. He stared at the test booklet, his eyebrows drawn together in a look of profound agony. He tried to fill in a bubble. His grip tightened. Snap! The pencil fractured in his massive hand, splintering into 2 jagged pieces of yellow wood. Several students looked up, startled. The proctor, a nervous-looking grad student with wire-rimmed glasses, frowned from his desk at the front of the room. Conrí carefully set the broken pieces down. He took a deep breath, his chest expanding massively, and pulled a spare pencil from his pocket. He turned the page of the booklet. He read the next question. He stared at the Scantron. Snap. The second pencil exploded under the sheer force of his grip. I pressed my forehead against the glass, murmuring a silent prayer to the patron saint of lost causes. "Breathe, Conrí. Just breathe." He wasn't breathing. He was panicking. I could see the rigid tension in his neck. His imposter syndrome was taking over, convincing him he couldn't decipher the academic language. The proctor stood up, looking highly irritated, and marched down the aisle toward Conrí. Even through the heavy wooden door, I could read the proctor's lips. "Sir, you need to keep it down." Conrí looked up at the proctor. The stress had pushed him right to the biological edge. His eyes, usually a warm, dark brown, flashed a sharp, reflective gold under the fluorescent lights. His lips peeled back involuntarily, just enough to reveal the elongated, razor-sharp tip of a canine tooth. It wasn't an intentional threat, it was pure, unadulterated panic manifesting as a biological defense mechanism. But the proctor didn't know that. The proctor took one look at the terrifying man snarling at him, turned paper white, and stumbled backward into a trash can. "Oh, God," I hissed. I didn't think. I shoved the heavy door open, shattering the sacred silence of the testing center. "Tutoring emergency," I announced loudly, marching straight down the aisle before the proctor could call campus security. I grabbed the collar of Conry's flannel shirt. "He's having a severe hypoglycemic reaction. It causes facial spasms. I need to administer juice immediately." Conry looked up at me, dazed, his eyes returning to normal. "Maya?" "Up," I ordered, hauling on his collar. He stood instantly, nearly overturning the desk. I grabbed his backpack, shoved the broken pencils into my pocket, and dragged the terrifying Alpha King out of the room by his shirt like a misbehaving toddler. I pulled him down the hallway and shoved him into an empty, brick-lined stairwell, letting the heavy metal door slam shut behind us to block out the rest of the world. "Hypoglycemic facial spasms?" Conry asked, his voice rough. "I panicked. You flashed a fang at an English Lit major, Conry. What happened?" Conry slumped back against the cold brick wall. All the fight, all the power completely drained out of him. He ran a trembling hand through his dark hair, looking utterly defeated. He didn't look like a king, or a monster, or an alpha. He just looked completely lost. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the concrete landing, his knees pulled up, hiding his face in his hands. "I didn't know a single answer on the second page," he whispered, the sound bouncing off the empty stairwell. He lifted his head, his eyes bright with unshed frustration, his voice cracking slightly as he finally admitted the truth he'd been hiding behind his scowls. "If I fail this, I lose the Pax land. I can't read this spreadsheet, Maya. I can't." I sank onto the concrete landing beside him, ignoring the grit biting through my cheap jeans. I didn't offer any empty platitudes or professional distance. I just nudged his massive shoulder with my own. "You are not failing," I told the empty stairwell, keeping my voice brutally level. "Because I am a terrifyingly effective educator and my pride absolutely refuses to allow it. But you clearly need a break." That break lasted exactly 48 hours, until he completely skipped our next library session. Which is exactly how I found myself standing in the cavernous, open bay doors of Apex Automotive on a Tuesday afternoon. The place smelled intensely of burnt rubber, raw exhaust, and industrial degreaser. A heavy metal track screamed from a blown-out stereo system, completely failing to mask the screech of pneumatic drills. "I'm looking for the owner," I shouted over the racket, glaring at a burly mechanic holding a tire iron. The mechanic blinked down at my cardigan, wiped a grease-stained hand on his overalls, and jerked his thumb toward a lifted truck. I marched over. A pair of heavy, steel-toed boots stuck out from beneath the chassis. I aggressively kicked the sole of the left boot. "You have missed 2 microeconomic modules, Conry." A loud thud echoed from under the truck, followed by a deeply gravelly curse. The crawler rolled out, revealing my truant student. My carefully constructed professional boundary spontaneously combusted. He was wearing a faded, oil-stained tank top that clung to every ridiculous muscular ridge of his torso. A dark smear of black grease streaked across his sharp jawline, and his hair was pushed back, damp with sweat. He looked like the rugged cover of a blue-collar calendar, and it was deeply, violently unfair to my nervous system. "Maya?" He sat up quickly, wiping his hands on a rag, his dark eyes widening in shock. "You tracked me down here?" "I have your schedule memorized through sheer force of will," I lied, dropping my heavy tote bag onto a nearby metal toolbox. I grabbed a dry erase marker and a heavy steel wrench from the workbench. I turned to a grimy whiteboard used for scheduling oil changes and wiped it clean with my sleeve. If you won't come to the syllabus comes to the garage. I drew a jagged line on the board, then smacked the metal surface with the heavy wrench. The sharp crack echoed through the garage, completely silencing the heavy metal music. Half a dozen mechanics stopped what they were doing, staring at me in terrified awe. Compound interest, I declared, pointing the wrench directly at Conry's chest. Explain it to me right now, or I swear to God I will drop a transmission on your foot. Conry slowly got to his feet, tossing his rag aside. A slow, incredibly devastating smirk spread across his face, completely transforming his harsh features into something dangerously magnetic. You look really good holding a wrench, Tutor. A murmur rippled through the silent mechanics. Someone in the back whispered, I got $20 on the tiny human. The transition from the deafening garage to the fluorescent purgatory of a midnight grocery run was jarring. We were pacing the aisles of a 24-hour supermarket because Conry refused to let me walk home empty-handed after expending vital calories shouting at him about interest rates. Our shopping cart squeaked agonizingly with every rotation. I need you to understand something about pack infrastructure, Conry rumbled, pausing awkwardly by the discounted cereal. He was still wearing his mechanic clothes, though he'd washed the grease from his hands. His massive frame made the cereal aisle feel incredibly claustrophobic. Infrastructure is key, I agreed pragmatically, tossing a box of generic oatmeal into the cart. Strong foundations prevent market collapse. He leaned heavily against the metal shelving, looking deeply uncomfortable. Right. Well, in our community, when the leadership identifies a highly valuable asset, a permanent addition to the executive team, so to speak, it's a very serious biological, structural commitment. I stopped reaching for the coffee beans. An executive addition? Conry, are you talking about a corporate merger? Yes, he said entirely too quickly, his eyes locking onto mine with a desperate, burning intensity. A merger. A lifelong, exclusive contract, where the management provides total security, housing, and resources in exchange for your permanent partnership. I stared at him, my sleep-deprived brain scrambling to process the data. He was talking about a job. The local shifter pack, which apparently operated as a highly lucrative auto repair and real estate conglomerate, was offering me a job. Are you offering me a paid internship? I asked, my voice hushed with absolute reverence. Conry choked on a sharp inhale. What? Because if this is an administrative role, we need to discuss compensation, I continued, aggressively stepping into his personal space. I tapped my index finger against his solid chest, completely immune to the sheer heat radiating off him. I do not work for exposure, Conry. I want health, dental, and a minimum of 4 weeks paid time off. And I want an office with a door that locks. He stared down at me, utterly baffled, his mouth opening and closing silently. He swallowed hard, looking like he had just stepped on a landmine. Yes, dental. You accept the terms? Obviously, I said, grabbing his massive hand and pumping it firmly to seal the deal. Consider me merged. Now buy me these discounted beans, boss. I turned the squeaking cart around, feeling completely victorious about my financial future, entirely missing the look of sheer, unadulterated horror on Conry's face as he realized he had just accidentally hired his fated partner as a corporate intern. My apartment was practically a closet with a hot plate, located directly above a very vocal 24-hour laundromat. When we walked in, the temperature was a sweltering 90 degrees, accompanied by the violent, rhythmic hissing of a broken iron radiator. I'm going to legally destroy my landlord, I announced, dropping the grocery bags onto the tiny laminate counter. I've filed 3 maintenance requests. I'll fix it, Conry stated immediately. You are an economics student, not a plumber. I'm a mechanic, he corrected smoothly, dropping to his knees beside the ancient iron radiator. He took up the entire kitchen floor space, dwarfing the tiny appliances. As he wrestled with the rusted valve, I stood frozen by the counter, hyper-aware of the suffocating heat and the sheer physical reality of him in my home. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of cedar and the faint musk of his exertion. He grunted quietly, the muscles flexing sharply under his shirt as he forced the heavy valve shut. The hissing immediately died down, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. "Done," he murmured, sitting back on his heels. He didn't stand up right away. His dark gaze drifted from the radiator up to my face, a slow, heavy heat building in his expression that had absolutely nothing to do with the apartment's temperature. "Conrí," I breathed, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He rose slowly, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that completely erased the awkward student persona. He stepped closer, crowding me gently against the kitchen counter. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was terrifyingly gentle, completely at odds with his size. "You shouldn't have to fix everything yourself, Maya," he whispered, leaning down. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my cheek. The professional boundary was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I tilted my head back, entirely ready to make a catastrophically unprofessional mistake. Ping. The sharp, electronic chime of his cell phone shattered the heavy tension like a brick through a window. Conrí stiffened. He pulled back, blinking rapidly, and reached into his pocket. He stared at the glowing screen. The warm, protective heat rolling off him instantly vanished, replaced by an icy, crushing wave of absolute dread. "What is it?" I asked, my voice still trembling. He looked up, his jaw set in a rigid line of total defeat. He took a deliberate step backward, distancing himself from me entirely. "The midterm grades just posted," he said, his voice entirely hollow. "I failed, and the developers, they just filed the official petition to seize the land." The silence in my sweltering kitchen was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the single pane of glass. Conrí was already retreating, his massive frame shrinking in on itself as he reached for the doorknob. The formidable predatory mechanic who had just silenced a hissing radiator with brute force was gone, replaced by a man drowning in his own perceived incompetence. "Where are you going?" I demanded, the sheer audacity of his surrender overriding my sudden heartbreak. "It's over, Maya," he rasped, the heavy wooden door creaking under his grip. He refused to meet my eyes. "I failed. The petition is filed. I'm not going to waste any more of your time or drag you down with a sinking ship. The developers won." "Oh, absolutely not," I snapped, aggressively snatching my waterproof tote bag off the counter and marching toward him. I shoved my arms into a bright yellow raincoat. "You do not get to unilaterally terminate our educational contract because of one pathetic, statistically insignificant midterm. Move." "Maya." "I said move, Conrí. We have a crisis to manage, and we cannot do it in a room that feels like a sauna." 20 minutes later, we were standing in the dead center of the sprawling campus quad. It was pitch black and pouring freezing rain. The manicured lawns were rapidly turning into a treacherous swamp. "Maya, this is mathematically insane," Conrí roared over the howling wind, water plastering his dark hair to his forehead and soaking through his shirt. "Go inside. You're a human. You're going to catch pneumonia and die. I am fueled by spite, poverty, and espresso. Biological sickness cannot breach my immune system," I yelled back, fiercely wiping freezing rain from my eyes. I pulled a meticulously laminated flashcard from my pocket. If the central bank aggressively buys government bonds, what happens to the overall interest rate? "I don't care about the central bank. I care that your teeth are literally chattering," he bellowed, stepping forward to physically shield me from the wind with his sheer mass. "Wrong!" I pointed a stern, trembling finger directly at the saturated mud. "Drop and give me 10. Conrí froze, rain cascading down his broad shoulders in sheets. "Excuse me?" "Physical exertion increases cognitive retention and forces the brain to bypass anxiety." I lied flawlessly, having absolutely no scientific basis for that claim. "You bombed the midterm because you were stuck in your own head. Now you're going to be in the mud, 10 push-ups. Do it now, or I will hit you with this binder. He stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, he let out a sound that was less human frustration and more apex predator fury, a guttural, chest-rattling snarl. But miraculously, the terrifying alpha of the local shifter pack dropped into the freezing, muddy grass. He pumped out 10 flawless, explosive push-ups, splashing freezing water everywhere. He surged to his feet, his chest heaving heavily. His dark eyes flashed a dangerous, highly reflective gold in the gloom, cutting through the rain. A low, vibrating growl ripped from his throat, echoing across the empty quad. The edges of his teeth looked distinctly sharper, his jaw locking in pure, instinctual frustration. "Do not bare your fangs at your tutor," I warned, completely unfazed by the display of apex lethality. "That is a 20-point deduction for flagrant unprofessionalism. Now tell me the formula for the spending multiplier before I make you do burpees." The golden, feral light faded from his eyes, leaving behind a look of raw, miserable awe. The growl died in his chest. 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. Correct. I stepped closer, tilting my pathetic umbrella to cover him, though it barely reached his collarbone. "I am not letting you lose your home, Conrí. Do you understand me? I will fight the Board of Regents with my bare hands if I have to. I am not letting you fail." He looked down at me, the rain tracking down his jaw. He didn't say a word, but the crushing defeat in his posture vanished, replaced by an ironclad, terrifying resolve. The weekend crash course required a desperate change of venue. Conry's woodland estate was not a serene, rustic cabin in the woods. It was a sprawling, chaotic architectural nightmare, filled with dozens of loud, aggressively energetic shifters who treated personal boundaries as loose suggestions. I sat in the center of Conry's massive, wildly disorganized home office, surrounded by towering stacks of zoning documents, property deeds, and macroeconomics textbooks. Outside the heavy oak doors, someone was loudly arguing about who ate the last of the venison, followed by the distinct sound of a table breaking. "How do you live like this?" I muttered, rubbing my temples as a fresh wave of panic threatened to pull me under. "It's a logistical nightmare. The property taxes alone." Conry was leaning against the stone fireplace, watching me with a heavy, unreadable expression. He had changed into a dry Henley shirt, but the tension in the room was suffocating. The reality of the stakes had finally crushed my pragmatic defenses. This wasn't just a grade anymore. This was an entire community sanctuary, and their alpha was trusting my sleep-deprived brain to save it. "Maya," he said quietly. "No, don't interrupt me. I'm trying to calculate the depreciation of the main lodge," I rambled, my breathing turning shallow and erratic as I flipped frantically through a ledger. If the developers leverage Clause 4B in the zoning statute, they can bypass the academic requirement entirely if the property isn't structurally compliant, which means we have to audit the— Maya, stop. I can't stop. If I stop, I drop a variable, and if I drop a variable, they take the land, and your entire pack is homeless, and it will be completely my fault because I didn't structure the study schedule correctly. I was hyperventilating now, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my red pen. It rolled across the vintage rug. In 2 long strides, Conry crossed the room. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply gripped my waist with his massive hands, lifted me out of my chair as easily as if I weighed nothing, and set me down firmly on the edge of his massive oak desk. He stepped between my knees, completely boxing me in. "Breathe," he ordered, his voice a low, rumbling command that demanded immediate compliance. I gasped for air, staring up into his dark, intense eyes. "I have to fix this." "No, you don't," he murmured, bringing his hands up to cup my face. His thumbs gently brushed my cheekbones. "You have spent the last month carrying my failures, managing my schedule, and fighting my battles. You are exhausted. You are completely burnt out. And I am not going to let you tear yourself apart trying to control the outcome of my life." "But the developers are my problem," he interrupted smoothly, stepping even closer until his solid chest pressed against mine. The scent of pine and rain was intoxicating, completely overwhelming my spiraling thoughts. I am the alpha of this pack. Let me carry the weight for 5 minutes, Maya. Let go of the spreadsheet. My hands, which had been rigidly clutching the edge of the desk, slowly uncurled. I slumped forward, resting my forehead against his shoulder, finally surrendering the agonizing need to control everything. He let out a heavy breath, wrapping his arms around me and pulling me flush against him. The professional boundary didn't just break, it evaporated. He tilted my chin up, his gaze dropping to my lips with a slow, devastating hunger. "Class is officially suspended," he whispered, right before his mouth crashed down on mine. The kiss was a desperate, tension-shattering collision. It was heat and friction and the undeniable proof that he wasn't just enduring my tutoring, he was entirely obsessed with me. I tangled my hands in his dark hair, pulling him closer, letting the heavy, frantic pace of it drown out every single academic anxiety I had left. Knock, knock. We ripped apart, both of us breathless. "Alpha," a muffled voice called from the hallway. "The university dean is on the phone. The developers moved the hearing up. It's tomorrow morning." The university dean's office smelled of expensive mahogany, floor wax, and impending doom. Conrí and I stood shoulder to shoulder before a massive desk, facing Dean Harrison and a disgustingly smug man in a custom Italian suit, Marcus Varg, the lead developer for the luxury condo project. "The bylaws are quite clear," Varg said, leaning back in a leather chair and studying his cuticles. "The deed requires the property owner to maintain academic good standing. Mr. Conrí failed his midterm, therefore he is on academic probation. The land defaults to the city, and my firm has already secured the purchasing rights. It's just business." Dean Harrison sighed, adjusting his glasses. "I'm afraid Mr. Varg is correct. The university cannot ignore the probation statute. You'll be dismissed from the program, Conrí." Conrí stood perfectly still, his jaw locked, his hands curled into massive fists at his sides. He was trying to suppress the primal urge to throw Varg through the plate glass window. He was trying to play by human rules, and he was losing. I felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over me. I unzipped my tote bag. "Actually," I said, my voice ringing out like a gunshot in the quiet room. I pulled out a massive 4-inch binder overflowing with color-coded tabs. "Mr. Varg's legal argument is fundamentally flawed and frankly embarrassing for someone in corporate real estate." Varg scoffed, looking at me like I was a lost intern. "Excuse me? And you are?" "I am Maya. I am the university's emergency economics tutor, and I am currently experiencing an unprecedented level of rage." I slammed the heavy binder onto the dean's immaculate desk. The thud made both men flinch. Clause 14, Section B of the University Charter, which predates your zoning laws by 70 years, explicitly states that academic probation cannot be officially enacted until the completion of the final examination period of the current semester. I flipped the binder open, slapping a highlighted page. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice rising in volume and ferocity as I rounded the desk, invading Varg's personal space. "The midterm grade does not finalize a GPA. Conrí has mathematically sustained the possibility of a passing grade if he scores an 85 or above on tomorrow's final. You are attempting to illegally seize sovereign land based on a preliminary progress report, which constitutes fraudulent acquisition." Varg's smug smile vanished. He sat up straight. "Now, wait just a minute." "No, you wait," I snapped, pulling out a secondary folder and tossing it at him. "I also audited your development firm's municipal tax filings last night. If you attempt to force an illegal eviction before the semester concludes, I will personally submit these discrepancies to the IRS, the local press, and the Board of Regents. I will tie this project up in so much litigation that your grandchildren will be paying the legal fees." The dean stared at me in absolute wide-eyed terror. Varg opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the tax documents with genuine panic. I turned to the dean, smoothing down the front of my cardigan. "He sits for the final exam tomorrow morning. If you try to stop him, I will sue this university for its entire endowment. Are we clear?" Dean Harrison swallowed hard and nodded frantically. "Crystal clear, Maya. The exam stands." I turned on my heel and marched out of the office. Conrí followed silently behind me. The moment the heavy oak doors shut, I sagged against the hallway wall, my knees shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline dump. Conrí stepped in front of me. He looked at me with an expression of such profound, earth-shattering awe that I actually stopped breathing. "You," he murmured, his voice thick with raw attraction, "are the most terrifying, magnificent creature I have ever seen." The adrenaline high of legally threatening a university official sustained me for exactly 14 hours, right up until we stood outside the frosted glass doors of the testing center the following morning. The hallway smelled aggressively of bleach, anxiety sweat, and number 2 pencils. The only sound was the rhythmic, agonizing tick-tick-tick of the industrial wall clock. Conrí was staring at the heavy wooden door like it was a live guillotine. He wore a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans, completely stripped of his mechanic gear or his intimidating flannels. Today, he wasn't a pack leader. He wasn't the guy who could crush a transmission with his bare hands. He was just a student walking into a final exam that determined the fate of 50 families. And I couldn't go in with him. "You know the formulas," I whispered, breaking the suffocating silence. My voice sounded thin, brittle in the empty corridor. I stepped into his space, tipping my head back to look at his rigid jawline. "You know the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. You know how to calculate inflation. We drilled this." "I know," he rumbled. He didn't look down at me. His gaze remained locked on the brass doorknob. "Conrí." I pressed my palm flat against the center of his chest. His heart was hammering, a frantic, irregular rhythm completely at odds with his usual stoic biology. "Look at me." Slowly, his dark eyes dropped to meet mine. The sheer terror in them made my own chest seize. "You are brilliant," I told him fiercely, dragging my thumb along the edge of his collarbone. "You manage a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio and a mechanic shop without breaking a sweat. This test is just a piece of paper written by bureaucrats who wouldn't last 10 minutes in your world. Don't let the formatting beat you." He let out a shaky breath. The rigid tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction. He reached up, his massive hand covering mine where it rested against his chest. His skin was warm, rough with calluses, and surprisingly steady. He pressed my palm tighter against his heartbeat. "If I fail," he started, his voice barely a rasp. "You won't," I interrupted, fiercely cutting off the possibility. "But even if you do, I'm not going anywhere. We'll find a loophole. We'll hire better lawyers. We'll squat on the land and make them drag us out. You are stuck with me, boss." A tiny, exhausted smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of my neck. I froze as his nose brushed my skin, a deeply intimate, grounding gesture that sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. He inhaled slowly, finding whatever calm he needed in the quiet space between us. "I'll see you in 2 hours, tutor," he murmured against my collarbone. He pulled back, gave me one last, unreadable look, and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The door clicked shut. The latch locked. I was entirely alone. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. I paced the linoleum floor until my sneakers squeaked a permanent groove into the wax. I chewed my thumbnail down to the quick. I aggressively reorganized my tote bag 3 times, terrified by the sudden realization that I wasn't just anxious for a student. I was hopelessly, irrevocably in love with a man who couldn't read a scatter plot. What if the scantron bubbles were too small? What if the absolute silence triggered his fight-or-flight response? What if he snapped his pencil again and the proctor kicked him out? Every minute stretched into a decade. Students began to trickle out, looking hollowed out and exhausted. None of them were Conrí. At 119 minutes, I slumped against the cinder block wall, sliding down to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. Then, the heavy brass latch clicked. The wooden door swung open with a slow, agonizing groan. Conrí stepped out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sharp shadows across his face. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look angry. He looked completely, terrifyingly blank. I scrambled to my feet, my heart launching itself into my throat. The tote bag slipped off my shoulder, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Well?" I gasped, the single word scraping my throat raw. Conrí stared at me, his dark eyes unblinking, his jaw tight, and slowly reached into his back pocket. His hand emerged from his back pocket. My breath hitched, expecting a crumpled withdrawal slip, an expulsion notice, or perhaps a white flag of surrender. Instead, he held up a standard yellow No. 2 pencil. It was perfectly intact, not a single bite mark, not a single fracture in the wood. "I didn't break it," he said quietly. I stared at the pristine writing utensil, the crushing weight of the last 2 hours instantly vaporizing. I laughed, a ragged, slightly hysterical sound, and sagged back against the cinder block wall. "You didn't break it." "I used the stress ball," he admitted, pulling the mangled, deeply indented blue foam earth from his other pocket. "I think I permanently flattened the entire continent of Australia, but I finished." Exactly 7 days later, the 24-hour waffle diner smelled gloriously of cheap syrup, stale coffee, and absolute victory. I sat in our usual sticky vinyl booth, though I wasn't grading papers. I was rhythmically tearing a paper napkin into microscopic shreds, my leg bouncing hard enough to rattle the silverware against the ceramic mugs. The official academic portal had updated at noon, but Conrí had explicitly forbidden me from looking it up. He insisted on delivering the news in person. The little bell above the diner door jingled. The atmospheric shift in the room was immediate and profound. The diner didn't go quiet out of fear. It went quiet because the man walking through the door demanded absolute gravitational attention. Conrí wasn't wearing a grease-stained mechanic's rag or a stressful, tightly buttoned flannel. He wore a sharply tailored black button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, dark jeans, and heavy boots. But it wasn't the clothes. It was the posture. The hunched, agonizingly tense student carrying the weight of the world was gone. The man striding toward my booth was the undisputed, unapologetic Alpha King. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his dark eyes locking onto me across the room with a focused heat that practically singed the laminate table. He didn't sit across from me. He slid smoothly into my side of the booth. The sheer mass of him pressed me gently against the cool glass of the window. The sudden proximity was devastating. I was instantly enveloped in the sharp, clean scent of cedar and the heavy, radiating warmth of his chest. His thigh pressed flush against mine under the table, an immovable line of solid muscle. "You're on my side of the table," I pointed out, my voice betraying me with a breathless waver. "I am," he agreed, his gravelly voice dropping an octave, vibrating right through my ribs. He reached into his chest pocket and withdrew a precisely folded piece of university letterhead. He placed it on the table between us. I stopped breathing. I reached out with trembling fingers, unfolded the crisp paper, and stared at the registrar's ink. Principles of Modern Macroeconomics. Final examination score. 88. Final course grade. B+. 88, I whispered, the printed numbers blurring slightly in my vision. "Conrí, you got an 88? "I missed the short answer question on international tariffs," he murmured, leaning in so close his lips brushed the shell of my ear. "But I completely nailed market equilibrium. The land is secure. The deed is locked tight. Varg and his developers packed up their corporate office this morning." Conrí shifted his weight, his large calloused hand coming up to gently trap my wrist against the table. "Which brings me to a very important administrative transition." I swallowed hard, hyper-aware of his thumb slowly stroking my rapidly beating pulse point. "A transition?" "According to the syllabus," he said smoothly, his eyes flashing with dark, unbridled amusement. "The semester is officially concluded. The grades are finalized. You are no longer on the university payroll for my academic progress." "That is technically true," I managed to say, desperately trying to maintain my pragmatic edge while my brain completely short-circuited. Which means, Conrí continued, a slow, incredibly dangerous smirk curving his mouth, I am no longer your student, and you can no longer give me detention for unprofessional conduct. He didn't wait for a response. He leaned down and captured my mouth. It wasn't the desperate, frantic collision from his office. This was slow, deliberate, and entirely possessive. He tasted like black coffee and absolute victorious confidence. His large hand slid from my wrist to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady as he completely dismantled every single one of my carefully constructed academic boundaries. I melted against him, gripping the front of his black shirt, entirely surrendering the control I had fought so hard to keep. When he finally pulled back, my head was spinning. The diner was completely silent. Several patrons in the neighboring booths were staring openly. I couldn't bring myself to care. So, I breathed, trying to reconstruct my shattered dignity while staring up into his eyes. If I'm not your tutor anymore? What exactly is my job title within this organization? Conrí chuckled, a deep, rich, chest-rumbling sound that made my toes curl in my sneakers. He stood up from the booth, pulling me up with him. Before I could process the sudden movement, he casually scooped me into his arms, lifting me off the sticky linoleum floor as if I weighed absolutely nothing. "Hey!" I yelped, grabbing his broad shoulders to steady myself. "Put me down, we haven't paid for the coffee." "I bought the diner yesterday," he said entirely deadpan, carrying me effortlessly toward the exit. "It's a long-term asset investment. And as for your job title, you're going to be very busy managing my portfolio, Maya, starting right now. Conrí, I demand to see a formal contract." He just laughed, kicking the diner door open and carrying me out into the cool autumn night. Class was permanently dismissed.